Jesus was traveling along the border between Samaria and Galilee, making his way toward Jerusalem. The air was crisp with the change of season, and the road wound through a mix of open countryside and scattered villages. Word of his presence often went ahead of him. Some had heard stories of his teachings, others whispered about his healings, and still others came simply out of curiosity. On this journey, as he approached a village, a group of men stood at a distance by the roadside. They did not come close, for their bodies bore the unmistakable marks of leprosy. The disease had stripped them of more than health. It had taken community, dignity, and the simple touch of other people. By law and custom, they were forced to live apart, to keep their distance from the healthy, to cry out warnings so no one would come near. Yet on this day, when they saw him, their voices rose above the usual warning. "Jesus, Master, have pity on us." The cry came as one, a chorus of desperation from men bound together by shared suffering. It was not a cautious request. They were pleading for mercy from the only one they believed could change their lives. Jesus stopped. He looked toward them, not with the fear or disgust so many showed, but with steady, unflinching attention. Then he spoke, his voice carrying clearly across the space between them. "Go, show yourselves to the priests." It was an unusual command. The priests were the ones who could declare a leper clean and allow them to return to society, but these men were still marked by the disease. Yet there was something in his tone, something in his authority, that stirred them to obey. Without argument, they turned toward the road that would lead them to the priests. As they walked, the change began. The lesions faded, the raw skin healed, the twisted hands and feet straightened. With each step, the pain eased, and the signs of disease disappeared. By the time they reached the outskirts of the next village, they were whole again. What had been years of living in exile ended in moments on the road, and their joy must have erupted in shouts, tears, and the rush of realizing they could go home. Yet among the 10, one man's joy took a different turn. He stopped in his tracks, looking at his restored skin, then looking back down the road they had traveled. The pull to return to family and friends was strong, but something stronger stirred in his heart, the need to go back to the one who had made him clean. And so, instead of continuing to the priests, he turned around. His pace quickened as he retraced his steps. When he saw Jesus, still on the road, he came running, his voice no longer a cry for mercy, but a shout of praise. Falling at his feet, he thanked him over and over, his gratitude pouring out in words and tears. The others had gone on, eager to reclaim the life they had lost, but this man chose first to give thanks, and he was a Samaritan. In the eyes of many Jews, Samaritans were outsiders, despised, distrusted, divided from them by generations of religious and cultural hostility. Yet it was this man, not one of the others, who returned to give glory to God. Jesus looked down at him and asked, "Were not all 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? Has no one returned to give praise to God except this foreigner?" His words carried both a sorrow at the absence of the others and a recognition of the faith before him. Then he said to the man, "Rise and go. Your faith has made you well." It was more than physical healing that had taken place in that moment. The leprosy had been removed on the road, but here, in his gratitude and faith, the man received something deeper, wholeness that reached beyond the body into the soul. The road stretched on toward Jerusalem, but the memory of that encounter would remain, a reminder that mercy given calls for gratitude returned, and that sometimes the least expected person is the one who truly understands the gift they've received. The Samaritan's breath came in short bursts as he rose to his feet at Jesus' command. His skin was smooth now, his limbs strong, but it was not only his body that felt different. Something deep within him was alive in a way it had never been before. He had lived for years defined by what was wrong with him, always on the outside, always identified by the disease. But now, standing before the one who had healed him, he felt the weight of that old life drop away completely. The others had not looked back. He could imagine them now, hurrying toward the priests, desperate to be declared clean so they could return to their families, their villages, their former lives. He understood their urgency. He had felt it too in the first moments of healing, but for him, that joy could not be complete without first returning to give thanks. It wasn't simply about politeness. It was about recognizing the source of the gift, about seeing the giver as more valuable than the gift itself. As he looked into Jesus' face, he heard again the question, "Where are the other 9?" It struck him as more than a lament for their absence. It was a call to examine his own heart. Gratitude was not something to be assumed, it was a choice. He had chosen to turn back, and in doing so, he had stepped into something greater than physical restoration. Jesus' final words to him, "Your faith has made you well," echoed in his mind. He knew that he had already been physically healed, but these words spoke to something deeper. This was wholeness that could not be touched by sickness or taken away by circumstance. This was the peace of knowing he was seen, known, and loved by the one who had both the power to cleanse and the authority to save. The road ahead for him was uncertain. As a Samaritan, he would still face prejudice in Jewish villages. Even in his own community, the story of his healing might be met with skepticism or twisted into rumor, but none of that seemed to matter now. His steps felt lighter, his vision clearer, as if the act of returning had opened not only his eyes but his entire way of seeing the world. Along the road, he passed travelers who glanced curiously at him. Some looked away quickly when they recognized the markings of a man who had once been set apart as unclean. Others stared in disbelief at the absence of sores and scars. A few even stopped him to ask what had happened. Each time, he told them the same thing. "I met Jesus. He saw me, and he healed me." The story was simple, but it carried a weight that silenced the skeptical and stirred hope in the desperate. Some asked where they could find him. Others shook their heads, uncertain whether to believe. The Samaritan did not argue. He knew his task was not to convince, but to bear witness. Gratitude had become his testimony. By the time he returned to his village, the word had spread. Friends and family who had not dared to come near him for years now stood at the edge of the road, hesitating at first, then rushing forward when they saw the truth with their own eyes. They embraced him, touched his face, held his hands, something none of them had done in so long that it felt almost like another kind of healing. That night, as the village gathered to hear his story, he told them of the 10 who were cleansed and of the one who returned. He spoke not to shame the others, but to show that healing is an invitation to something greater, relationship with the one who gives it. And as he spoke, he realized that this was the heart of his gratitude. Not just that he had been freed from leprosy, but that his healing had led him to truly know Jesus. From that day on, every time he remembered the moment on the road when his skin became clean, he also remembered the moment he turned back. Both were miracles. One restored his body, the other restored his heart. In the days after his return to the village, the Samaritan often found himself waking before dawn. The quiet hours before the marketplace stirred to life became his time to walk alone, to remember and to give thanks. The cool air carried the sense of the earth and the faint aroma of baking bread from nearby homes, ordinary smells that felt extraordinary to him now. Every detail of life seemed sharper, fuller. His hands were strong enough to work again, his feet swift enough to carry him across hills, his voice free enough to greet people without warning them to keep their distance. Yet the deeper change was harder to put into words. The man who had once defined himself by his illness now found his identity reshaped by the encounter with Jesus. Healing had not erased his past, but it had reframed it. The years of separation, loneliness, and pain were now part of a larger story, a story that had led him to a single moment on the road when mercy found him. He thought often about the other 9. He did not resent them for not returning. Perhaps they were still grateful in their own way. But he wondered if they understood what they had missed. The chance to look into the eyes of the one who had healed them, to receive not only restoration, but relationship. For him, turning back had been as much a step of faith as walking toward the priests. His conversations with neighbors revealed just how remarkable the healing was. Many admitted they had never expected to see him again, except from a distance. Some spoke quietly about the prejudice they held against Samaritans and how his story challenged them. Others asked him if he believed Jesus was a prophet or something more. In every answer, he returned to the same truth. He is the one who made me well. He spoke, and I was healed. I went back to thank him, and he said my faith had made me whole. The words whole and well carried a weight he had never considered before. Physical health was precious, but this was something that reached deeper, touching every corner of who he was. It was the kind of healing that no relapse could undo, the kind of restoration that did not depend on circumstances. In the weeks that followed, he found himself noticing those who were overlooked: the beggar on the edge of the market, the widow selling small bundles of herbs, the child who played alone while others ran in groups. He remembered what it was to be unseen, to live at the margins, and he could not walk past them without stopping. Sometimes all he offered was a word of kindness or a shared meal, but each act felt like an echo of the mercy he had received. When he told his story to travelers passing through, he began to see how gratitude could be more than an emotion. It could be a way of life. Returning to thank Jesus had set the course for every step he took afterward. It reminded him daily that everything he had, health, community, the simple joy of being able to stand in the sunlight, was a gift. And gifts were meant to be acknowledged, cherished, and shared. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the hills, he sat with a group of friends who pressed him for more details about the day of his healing. They wanted to know what Jesus looked like, what his voice sounded like, what he said after the others had gone. The Samaritan described the steady gaze, the calm authority, the words that seemed to carry both power and peace. But he told them something else as well, that the moment he fell at Jesus' feet and gave thanks was the moment he realized the healing of his body was only the beginning. Leprosy kept me apart from people, he told them, but my heart had been apart from God. When I turned back, I found both my healer and my Lord. That is why I am whole. His friends sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his words settling over them. Some would remember that night for years, telling others how gratitude had led one man to a greater miracle than the one everyone could see. News of the Samaritan's healing did not stay within the boundaries of his village. Travelers along the trade routes carried the story to neighboring towns, and soon people from beyond his community began seeking him out. Some came out of curiosity, others with skepticism, and still others with their own burdens of sickness or despair. He was not a healer, but he knew the one who was, and he never hesitated to speak his name. When strangers arrived, he welcomed them without reservation. He would listen to their questions, sometimes to their pain, and then share the account of that day on the road. He described how the 10 had stood at a distance, how their voices had risen together, how Jesus had told them to go to the priests. And he would pause before telling the moment he turned back, the moment gratitude redirected his steps toward the giver rather than the gift. It was in that choice, he explained, that his healing became something deeper. Some nodded in understanding, while others struggled with the idea that gratitude could lead to more than thankfulness, that it could open the door to a new kind of life. But his calm conviction and unshakable joy made it difficult to dismiss his words. One day, a merchant from a distant town lingered after hearing his story. "I have leprosy in my family," the man confessed quietly. "They are hidden away as the law requires. Do you believe Jesus would help them?" The Samaritan did not hesitate. "I believe he would see them," he said, "and if he sees them, he will not turn away." It was encounters like these that revealed to him how far his testimony could reach. He began to travel short distances, sometimes joining caravans, sometimes walking the roads alone, stopping in villages to share his account. He had no title, no authority in the religious structures of the land, but people listened because his words carried the weight of a life changed. In one Samaritan town, a group gathered around him after hearing of his visit. Among them was a young man who had lost his sight years before. The Samaritan sat beside him, speaking not of healing in the body first, but of the healing that comes from faith. "Even before my skin was cleansed, I believed enough to walk toward the priests," he said. "Faith often starts before you see the result." His journey was not without resistance. In certain villages, closer to Jewish settlements, the old prejudices between Jews and Samaritans made some wary of him. A few dismissed his story altogether because the one who healed him was a Jew. But even then, he did not argue. Instead, he told them simply, "All I know is this: I was unclean, and now I am clean. I was outside, and now I have been brought near." The one who did this was Jesus. Over time, the Samaritan came to see that his role was not to persuade every listener, but to bear faithful witness to the truth. The choice of whether to believe was never his to control, but the choice to speak was always his to make. And with each telling, the gratitude in his heart deepened, shaping his words and actions alike. In his own village, his presence became a reminder that mercy had walked their roads. The children who had once been told to stay away from him now ran to greet him. Families invited him to share meals. Even elders, cautious at first, found themselves moved by his humility and consistency. His story became part of the life of the community, a living example of what could happen when someone not only received a gift from God, but returned to give thanks. He often thought of the road where it all began. Sometimes when traveling, he would pass near it again. He would stop for a while, looking down the stretch of path where he had first seen Jesus. The memory of that moment never faded. The sound of his voice, the clarity of his command, and the life-changing choice to turn back. Each time he stood there, it renewed his commitment to live a life that pointed others toward the same mercy. His journeys eventually brought him to towns where Jews and Samaritans crossed paths only out of necessity, trading goods, passing through on the way to somewhere else, keeping their conversations brief and their distance measured. The old hostilities ran deep, passed down through generations like an inheritance no one dared question. In one such village near the border, he found himself speaking to a small crowd that was unusual in its makeup, both Jews and Samaritans standing together, drawn more by curiosity than by any desire for unity. Some had heard rumors of his healing. Others came simply because the mention of Jesus' name stirred a mix of interest and suspicion. He began the same way he always did, recounting the day he and 9 others had stood at a distance, calling out for mercy. He described the command to go to the priests and the miracle that unfolded as they walked. And then he told of his choice to turn back and thank Jesus. At this point, he noticed the shifting expressions in the crowd. Some Samaritans looked at the Jews with a hint of pride, as if to say, "It was one of us who returned." But before that pride could take root, he continued, "I was the only one who went back, not because I was better, but because gratitude took hold of me in that moment and wouldn't let me keep walking. Jesus asked, 'Where are the other 9?' And then he called me whole. That wholeness had nothing to do with where I was from. It had everything to do with the faith he saw in me." The words softened the air between them. For a moment, the lines that divided Jew from Samaritan seemed less sharp. Someone in the crowd, a Jewish merchant, spoke up. "You are saying he did not care that you were a Samaritan?" The healed man smiled. "If he had cared, he would not have told me to go to the priests, knowing I could not even enter their courts. He saw me before he saw my label. And when he healed me, he gave me more than skin without sores. He gave me a place in his presence." In the quiet that followed, an older Samaritan man muttered, almost to himself, "Maybe we've been looking at each other wrong." The words were small, but they were a crack in the wall that had stood for centuries. Later that evening, as he sat outside the village with a few who had stayed to ask more, a Jewish traveler admitted, "I've avoided Samaritans my whole life, but hearing your story, it makes me wonder if I've been blind in ways I didn't see." The healed man did not gloat. He simply nodded and said, "Gratitude opens your eyes. It makes you see people as gifts, not as threats." In other towns, the effect was slower, but the seeds were still planted. A Samaritan shepherd once told him that after hearing his account, he had helped a Jewish trader fix a broken cart on the roadside. A small act, but one that would have been unthinkable before. A Jewish woman in another village confessed that she had started praying for the Samaritans she saw passing by, asking God to bless them instead of cursing them under her breath. He never set out to bridge divides. His only aim was to give thanks and tell the truth. But his story had a way of slipping past defenses, because it was not an argument, it was a life transformed. And in that transformation, people saw something greater than cultural boundaries. The man often reflected on how gratitude had changed the course of his life. It was more than a polite response to kindness, it was a force that reoriented his steps, drew him back to the source of his healing, and kept his eyes open to see the dignity in others. It had freed him from the prison of resentment and taught him to carry mercy into every conversation, even those shadowed by old prejudice. By the time he returned to his own village after months of traveling, he carried more than the memory of his healing. He carried stories of people who, because they had heard of his choice to turn back, had begun to turn toward each other. And he knew then that gratitude had a way of multiplying, passing from one heart to another, breaking down walls one act of thanks at a time. Months after his healing, the Samaritan often found himself returning to the same stretch of road where it had all begun. The place was unremarkable to anyone else, just a dusty path between villages, with low hills rising in the distance. But to him, it was sacred ground. Here was where he had stood in his rags, calling out for mercy. Here was where Jesus had seen him, spoken to him, and given him a command that would change everything. Sometimes he came alone, walking in silence and letting the memory wash over him. Other times, travelers would notice him lingering there and ask why. And each time he would tell the story, not just the part about the healing, but about the turning back, the falling at Jesus' feet, the words that declared him whole. The longer he lived, the more he realized that the miracle of his skin being cleansed was only the doorway to the greater miracle of his heart being restored. Life after that day was not without its challenges. There were seasons of scarcity, moments of misunderstanding, times when the old prejudices resurfaced and threatened to undo the fragile connections being formed between Jews and Samaritans. But gratitude had rooted itself so deeply in him that it steadied him through those times. He no longer measured his life by what he lacked, but by the gift he had received. And that gift was not merely health, it was the presence of Jesus, the assurance that he had been seen, touched, and loved. He became known in surrounding towns not simply as the man who had been healed, but as the man who always gave thanks. Even when speaking of hardships, he found a way to name the grace within them. People began to notice that gratitude was not just something he felt when things were good, it was something he practiced when things were hard. And in that practice, his faith deepened. The more he reflected, the more he saw how gratitude could be a force that transformed communities. It softened the edges of old divisions, reminded people of their shared humanity, and lifted their eyes beyond their own concerns. He had seen it happen on dusty roads and in crowded marketplaces, how a story told with genuine thanks could open hearts in ways arguments never could. He knew he would likely never see Jesus again in this life, but he also knew that the life he now lived was the truest expression of thanks he could give. Every act of kindness, every moment of mercy, every story told was another way of returning to that place on the road and falling at his feet all over again. Sometimes, when speaking to groups, he would end with a quiet challenge. 10 were cleansed that day, he would say, but only 1 turned back. It is not enough to receive a gift. You must acknowledge the giver. Gratitude will take you further than healing. It will bring you into the presence of the one who heals. For those who listened with open hearts, his words stayed long after he had gone. Some would later tell him that they had begun to thank God each morning before the day's work. Others said they had gone out of their way to mend relationships they had long neglected. He never claimed credit for these changes. He knew they were simply the ripples of God's work through his testimony. As the years passed, the Samaritan carried the memory of Jesus' voice like a treasured song. It guided him through joy and hardship, shaped the way he saw others, and kept his heart steady in faith. And when strangers asked why he spoke so often of that day, his answer was always the same: because I never want to forget what he did for me, and I never want anyone else to miss the chance to turn back. For us, his story stands as more than a record of an ancient miracle. It is a living reminder that blessings can fade from our attention if we do not stop to give thanks. It urges us to resist the rush to move on and instead turn back toward God, toward gratitude, toward the deeper wholeness he offers. Healing may change our circumstances, but thanksgiving changes our hearts. If this story moves you, take a moment today to remember what God has done for you. Speak it aloud, share it with someone, and most of all, turn back to the one who gave it. That is where true wholeness is found. If you want to hear more stories that inspire faith, deepen your walk with Christ, and challenge you to live with gratitude every day.